So with the book of Nahum, in our review this morning, we see that it comes about 100 years after the events of the book of Jonah, 80, 100 or so. And the people of Assyria, which Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, that's where Jonah went, you see that they apparently did not pass on their understanding of God's goodness and greatness to their children, and those were not passed on to even further to their children, because Assyria has become just as wicked as ever. Nineveh has become just as wicked as ever. They have taken the northern kingdom, and it is a place that is not even going close to the correct direction that God would like them to go. And so the book of Nahum is primarily about judgments on Nineveh, and also judgments on the people in Judah who are practicing the same way that the Ninevites are. It doesn't leave out anybody. If anybody is practicing these evils in Judah, which Nahum is prophesying to Judah, because again, the northern kingdom has been taken captive. They will be included in those judgments as well, or they'll be included in other judgments. And so we saw, especially in chapter 3, that Nineveh is kind of a type of Babylon in the book of Revelation, that it represents in the Old Testament this coming kingdom which will be destroyed. It's kind of a type of the kingdom that's led by the Antichrist that comes in to take and put down the Jewish people, and then it is judged, and then after that you'll see the restoration of the people. Now the restoration isn't included in this representation here. It's just the judgment that's kind of being represented here. So, like I said, we won't have a quiz over Nineveh or over Nahum, but the biggest thing to understand with Nahum is that it is primarily geared toward judgment on the Assyrian people. You see that same kind of thing with the book of Obadiah. It's primarily geared toward judgment on the Edomites. It's not really something that has a particular message directly for the Jewish people, the people that Nahum is prophesying to in Judah. The message is primarily to the Assyrians, but it is for the people in Judah, and it is for us today, but it may not necessarily be to them or to us. So then, just turn a few pages, we get to the book of Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk, we will have some quiz material over it. So just in verse 1 of chapter 1, we'll start out and we'll just read a few verses. It says, "The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see." Now, I want to make that clear because Habakkuk here has a burden, and as we talked about last week, in the book of Zephaniah, we can kind of divide the book up a little bit in Zephaniah. We have the visions, which all occurred in one night. We have kind of these historical events and prophecies that occurred in the next two chapters. And then basically chapters 9 onward are prophetic burdens. It's the burdens which the Lord places on Zechariah. It's the burden of the word of the Lord. And so we see that the remaining part of the book of Zechariah are those burdens. And Habakkuk here describes what he sees as a burden. And he says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save." And so remember that in chapter 1, Habakkuk is wondering, why God allows some bad things to happen, why some bad things happen on earth, why is there wickedness in Israel, why does he allow this sin to go on? And he says in verse 6, though, we'll start in verse 5. It says, "Behold ye among the heathen in regard, and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful, their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar, and they shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand." And so here Habakkuk is speaking to the people of Judah, And he's saying that, well, why are you allowing this wickedness to go on in Judah? And then from verse 5 down, you see God says, well, I'm not allowing it, indefinitely. He said, I'm long-suffering, but this is what's on the way. He says, this judgment of the Chaldeans is on the way, and these are the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. God is describing through Habakkuk here what's the judgment that was to come upon the people of Judah whenever the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, attacked. And it's not pretty. And then you see Habakkuk later on in the chapter, he says, well, I don't understand. He says, well, why are you allowing this evil to go on? And then God answers that. Perfectly fine answer. He says, I'm not allowing it. I'm going to let judgment occur. I'm going to cause judgment. And then Habakkuk says, well, how can you allow such a terrible judgment to occur? Why are you doing that? And so in chapter 2, you see the answer to that. Habakkuk says, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower. This is in verse 1. And will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. And, you can read down there and you can see more of what God has to say to him. And he says in verse 12, woe to him that buildeth a town with blood, and establisheth the city by iniquity. And so he says, I'm going to judge the Babylonians too. He says, don't you worry, just because they're, I'm using them in judgment doesn't mean they're in my perfect will either. God can use evil and wicked people to accomplish his purpose when he sees fit. Doesn't mean the evil and wicked people are correct to be evil and wicked. They will experience that judgment too. Just look at, I think one of the best examples in the Bible is Judas Iscariot. God doesn't condone treachery. He doesn't condone the evil that Judas committed. He doesn't condone lying and theft and the prioritization of money over all else. Doesn't condone any of those things, but he used that in Judas's life so that Jesus would be able to make that sacrifice. He didn't force Judas into that. Judas made that decision. You can see in Scripture where it talks about Satan entering him. I still think Judas was making decisions, even though he basically allowed Satan to take the throttle. But I think that Judas was still in control of the wheel, if you want to put it in terms that we might be able to understand today. So, this is the same kind of thing with this judgment of the Babylonians here. God isn't making the Babylonians do something and then asking, well, why'd you do that? I have to punish you for it now. It's not what's going on. God is allowing the Babylonians to do what they're going to do, and he's allowing it to happen so that he can judge his people. And then he's going to punish them later on for their sin, because it is sin. Habakkuk's questions are pretty much answered by God. And we talked about this when we went through the book in chapter 1. Why would God allow terrible things to happen? And the answer to Habakkuk's specific question, which is why is this wickedness going on in Judah, God answered that really easily. But that kind of greater question that it gets at, well, why does God allow anything bad to happen at all? Why does sin even exist? Why is there wickedness on earth? Why is there pain and death and anguish and suffering and all of these things? It's a product of sin. Sin is a product of what you get when you have people who can choose between whether to follow God or whether to not follow him. You will get people who will choose not to follow him. And you can look back on Adam and Eve and you can say, well, that's not fair. That's not fair. I shouldn't be accountable for their sin. It's not fair that I inherited my sin nature from them. Well, I'll pose it to you in this way. If you were in their position, unfallen, if it were you in their unfallen position in the garden, and you had the opportunity to take of the fruit, and you were tempted to take of the fruit, would you have done any better? No. That's if you can humble yourself to the point where you can see that, you can understand how free will produce sin, and you can understand how sin can produce evil, and you can understand why there is evil in the world, yet God is still perfect, yet He is still just, yet He is still righteous, and these things can still exist. It doesn't take away from the righteousness and perfection of God, that He created creatures with the ability to be imperfect. Doesn't make God any less perfect. Doesn't make God any less good or any less holy or any less righteous. So, understanding that, Habakkuk chapter 3 is a psalm of praise to God, and it's asking for grace and mercy and giving God praises and glory. We'll read a little bit of it here, and starting in verse 2. He says, O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make known. In wrath remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praise. And His brightness was as the light, and He had horns coming out of His hand, and there was the hiding of His power. Now remember what we talked about. Horns in the Bible, in a figurative sense, typically represent nations. And so here it looks to me, and I may have gone over this in a little bit of detail, but it looks to me like this psalm of praise is also a psalm of prophecy, and it's discussing, he's praising God for things that have yet to be. His brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of His hand, and there was the hiding of His power. Now, look back at verse 3, though. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praise. When was the last time that the earth was full of praise for God? I don't think it ever has been. Maybe upon creation, we get glimpses of things in Scripture from the book of Ezekiel where we see that they sang praises at creation, that the angels did and the cherubs did. We see that Satan himself at one time participated in praises of God. He was participant in that as a creation of God, as one of the cherubs. At the time when he used to follow God's will, he participated in that. Maybe then, I don't think this is what it's talking about, because you see here in verse 4, it's talking about Him having horns coming out of His hand. And if I'm correct, and as I've seen everywhere else in the Old Testament and everywhere else in the book of Revelation, where horns are a representative, they're a representation, they're a figure for a nation. There were no nations at the beginning of creation. There will be nations in the new creation. There will be nations when New Jerusalem comes down from God out of heaven. There will be nations whenever Jesus establishes His kingdom here on earth for 1,000 years. After that is going to come the rebellion, and after that the great white throne, and after that New Jerusalem comes down. There will be nations then in that new heaven and new earth. And I think that's what Habakkuk is talking about here. He's praising God in the present for something that's going to happen in the future. I hope that makes sense. But again, the rest of this chapter is just a great psalm of praise, rivals anything David wrote. It is a magnificent psalm of praise. We aren't going to read the whole thing again this morning, but if you ever want to be edified, or if you ever just want to sing a praise to God and you can't come up with the words, Habakkuk gives you words just as good as any. So now, moving out of Habakkuk and on to the book of Zephaniah, we'll look at Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 1. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord which came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah. So he's the son of the son of the son of Hezekiah. Hezekiah being Hezekiah from the book of Isaiah, one of the few good kings of Judah. And when we say good kings of Judah, we don't mean perfect kings of Judah. good kings of Judah still did bad things. The difference between them and the bad kings was that they tried to do the right thing at least most of the time. They failed a lot. We fail a lot. I think that you could pretty easily say that that's a human thing to do, is to fail. So when we look at them and we divide them up into good kings and bad kings, we aren't going necessarily off of God's standards of perfection. We're going off of God's grace and God's mercy and those who God showed favor to there. Because you can see pretty clearly there's a line that says, whenever you look at these kings, and it says, and he did all that evil that which his fathers did, and some of them says, and more. Some of them do worse. But other kings, it'll say they did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. It doesn't say they did that which was right in the sight of the Lord 100% of the time. It says they did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. So I think that's how we're looked at today. Even though we don't do that which was right all the time, we have the blood of Christ covering our sins, so that God can look at us and He can apply His righteousness to us, and we can be right in His sight. We can be right in the sight of the Lord because of that. And so that's what these people were looking forward to. Any of those good kings, any of the Old Testament saints, they were looking forward to the cleansing blood, whether they knew it or not. They were looking forward to that. And now we rely on what Christ has done for us in the past, and we look forward to His second coming. Because He's not done yet. He's not dead. He's alive. So we see here now in verse 2, I wanted to make that positive statement, because in verse 2 of Zephaniah chapter 1, it says, I will utterly consume all things from off the land, saith the Lord. And Zephaniah here is speaking to the Jewish people. He says, I will consume man and beast, I will consume the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked, and I will cut off man from the land, saith the Lord. I will also stretch out mine hand upon Judah and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the name of the Chemarims with the priests. And if you read down there in verse 5, he says, and them that worship the host of heaven upon the housetops, and them that worship and that swear by the Lord, and that swear by Malcham. Malcham being Molech, the god which we've talked about was a false god. He was a false idol of the Ammonites. He was the one that they would build a statue to, and he had the hands, and they would turn this crank, and the hands would come apart. Well, below those hands was this fire. It was meant to be like the god's belly. And they would place their firstborn children upon this idol, and they would turn those cranks, and those hands would come apart, and it would drop the child into the fire. That was called sacrificing your firstborn to Molech, or Moloch, however you want to pronounce it. It's sin, and it's horrible. It's evil. And they would do this. And so this became, I don't know that it became widespread practice for the Jewish people to sacrifice their firstborn to Molech, but they did worship Molech, and Solomon himself built a temple to Molech whenever he was doing all of his public works projects and temple building and building and whatnot. That was one of the things that ended up being built. And so you see it's a blight that just kind of never leaves these people. They kind of, when their leaders do something, they think it's right, and they follow it. And you see that's a problem in our country today. When you get leaders in the nation who, doesn't matter what political party they're a part of, if they're doing something wrong, it's wrong. If they're saying something wrong, it's wrong. But you get people, they get tied to somebody that they like real well, And a lot of these people like Solomon. A lot of these people like their current king, even though their current king was sinful. Today, a lot of people like their political leaders. They like their congressman. They like their senator. They like their governor. They like their mayor. They like this. They like that. I think it's better whenever you're talking about politicians to stick to the policy that I don't like any of them. And they all could do a better job. That'd probably be a healthier way to look at it, but people. Yeah, they all do a good job promising, and that's. I think Absalom did a good job of promising. If you want to see a biblical If you want to see a biblical politician, and by biblical I mean in the Bible, I don't mean he practiced biblical principles. You want to see a politician in the Bible acting like a politician, look at Absalom. He's one of the best, and you see a lot of people today, they do the same things. Politics have always been politics. It's a big popularity contest. So that being said, we'll get back into the Word here, and I'll leave that soapbox for outside the church building. But he says in verse 7, "Hold thy peace at the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand, for the Lord hath prepared a sacrifice. He hath bid his guests." And he's talking about the day of the Lord. There's going to be a sacrifice. In the day of the Lord, in that day, in the tribulation, it's not going to be pretty for the Jewish people. I think it's very clear, and God is very clear in Scripture, that the tribulation is part and parcel of judgment. It's not just that He's allowing the Antichrist to just do this for the sake of allowing him to. I mean, he's got a purpose. God's allowing it for a reason, and He's gonna cleanse the world of a whole lot of things before He cleanses the world of the Antichrist. And so you see that there. That's all that's left of the Jewish people. We could go read it. We're not going to this morning. In Revelation chapter 7, there's 12,000 from the 12 tribes. There's 144,000. That's all that's left of the Jewish people. There are millions upon millions of Gentiles left around, but you talk about a remnant, 144,000 people out of millions. That's a remnant. And God works mostly with remnants because most people don't accept Him. Most people don't follow Him. And we know that if His will were done all the time, everybody would come to Him. But they don't. So this book, again, it's a book of judgment. Something I forgot to point out about Habakkuk really quickly. We see that Zephaniah is a descendant of Hezekiah, so he's a noble person. He's a person of some standing whenever God calls him to be a prophet here. But Habakkuk, we know nothing about him other than that he was a prophet. I mean, you try to find stuff about him, good luck. The Lord, we'll know him in heaven, I think. We'll get to learn all about him. But down here, God didn't see it important to say who Habakkuk was the son of, and who that son was the son of, and who that son was the son of. God called this man to a specific purpose, and he fulfilled it, and God called Zephaniah to a specific purpose, and he fulfilled it, regardless of whether he was the great or great-great-grandson of Hezekiah. So, it just goes to show that God can use anybody, whether they're famous, whether they're noble, whether they're common, whether they're poor, whether they're rich. God can use anybody. But we see that in the rest of chapter 1 here, it's all about judgment, and it is judgment on the Jewish people. Now, in chapter 2, we see that there's judgment upon Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gaza, and it's judgment on the Philistines, it's judgment on Moab, it's judgment on a whole lot of people. You see in chapter 2, it's judgment on the Philistines. You see that it's judgment on the Ethiopians to the south. The Philistines were to the west. You see it's judgment on the Assyrians to the north, and judgment on the Moabites and the Ammonites to the east. And not specifically in that order, but those are the four main people groups that are mentioned here in chapter 2. And they're all going to be judged. So, and we talked about just last week, I think it was last week, that the Philistines, once they were judged by Alexander, once God sent Alexander the Great to steamroll that place, there's no more Philistine nation. You have people that call themselves Palestinians, but they're Arabs. They're just as Arabs as the people in Saudi Arabia. There's no real difference between them other than geography. Their culture, the same. Language, the same. Physical characteristics, the same. They're pretty much the same people in a different place. And it's not really that far apart if you look on a map. Saudi Arabia, Israel here, the Gaza Strip right here. It's all just right mixed in together. So they call themselves a Palestinian people and that they deserve their own nation, but there's never been a Palestinian people in all of history. There were the Philistines. They were wiped out. So it goes back to what we were talking about in that long, great big study whenever we did leading up to the book of Obadiah, where about the Edomites. And I said last week that I think, not know, but think that the Palestinians, the Philistines, what was left of them, mixed with the Edomites, and so you get this Arab nation living in the Gaza Strip, living in Ashkelon and Ashdod, and they fall into that same trap of, well, the Jewish people stole from us. It's our birthright and they took it. It's our blessing and they took it. It's our land and they took it. It's our this and they took it. And that same thing is what's being preached in the Quran within Islam. Well, the Jewish people this, they did this, they said this, but really it's this. Really, we own it, it's ours. Allah has promised it to us. We are the chosen. They're the twisters and the perverters of the word. We have the real one. And that's their message. And it's really easy for a people that hate the Jewish people to or even have a mild dislike. I won't even necessarily go so far as to call all of them hateful. But, it's really tempting to fall into an ideology that kind of justifies your viewpoints about the world. It's really easy to make your ideology conform to you as opposed to conforming to God and His principles. So, anyway, there's that. More judgment, not judgment on Judah, but judgment on surrounding nations. And Ethiopia, I wouldn't even call a surrounding nation. It's really far south down in Africa, but they did have relations with the Ethiopians because they lived. If you look at a map, Israel is pretty much the center of the known world there. Every road goes through it, or right to the right of it. Major trade right there. Got a coastline. Got the King's Highway running up there on the other side of the Dead Sea by the Jordan River. Just everybody wanted that place because everybody wanted to be able to control it, to go through it. But God called the Israelites, He called them to live in it and to farm it and to keep it. So if I don't stop there with that, I'll get on something else that we don't have time for. But we'll move on. Looking at chapter 3, it says, "Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city." And here he's talking about Jerusalem. And that's why it's so important when we read in the books of Haggai and especially Zephaniah, where God will choose Jerusalem again. God has chosen Jerusalem. He will choose Jerusalem again. He will choose Jerusalem again. He will choose Jerusalem again. It's because he looks at Jerusalem here in Zephaniah as that filthy and polluted and oppressing city. Doesn't look at it as his city that he chose to dwell in. He looks at it as a corrupt pile of sin and an evil. And so there's going to be judgment there. But then if you look at verse 8 in chapter 3 of Zephaniah, you see from verse 8 on there's a prophecy of restoration. He says, "Therefore wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord, to serve him with one consent. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering." And you see the rest of it is about the restoration. And you see in verse 14, "Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, and be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord hath taken away thy judgments. He hath cast out thine enemy, thy King of Israel. Even the Lord is in the midst of thee. Thou shalt not see evil any more." And so here, God himself is calling himself the King of Israel. And he's saying that he will be in the midst of thee. And I think that's very clearly a reference to the millennial kingdom, is when this true restoration takes place. This restoration didn't take place after the Babylonian captivity. It didn't take place in 1947, 1948. It's not taking place right now. It's going to take place 7+ years from this exact instant. And I'll keep saying 7+, because at any instant we could be called to meet him in the air. And that's when it starts, 7 years. So 7+ years from now, at least. Anyway, that's the book of Zephaniah. Now Haggai, we'll try to go through it pretty quickly. I've pretty much reviewed over the first chapters of Zephaniah with pretty much every chapter that we've been going through, so we're not going to review all those chapters of Zephaniah again today, even though we will have a quiz on those first. It'll be part of the quiz next week. I'm just going to trust that saying it, 5-6 times kind of helps cement it a little bit, and hope for the best there. But it always helps to hear it again, so I'll probably review it, after the quiz. I'll be reviewing it during the quiz for sure next week. So, Haggai, chapter 1, remember, it says, in the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest. And so remember that Haggai is one of the 2 prophets at this time. It's Haggai and Zechariah. If you look back at the book of Ezra, Ezra chapter 5, Ezra chapter 5 in verses 1 and 2, it says, Then the prophets, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Josedek, and began to build the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. And so that's really important, because they were prophets, but they also weren't just standing around talking. That's not all they did. They worked. They put their labor where their mouth was, and they helped in the reconstruction of the temple. They built. And so you could say they had double duty as builders and as prophets. And so that's what they did. And so Haggai is one, and he's giving the word to Zerubbabel, and he's giving the word to Joshua. And Zerubbabel, remember, is the governor. He's been given authority by the king of Persia, by Darius, and before him by Cyrus, the king of Persia, and in between Artaxerxes. And so he's been allowed to be the governor here. And they started the building process, and then they just kind of let it go. And so in verse 2 it says, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, The time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, Consider your ways. And he says that again in verse 7. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Consider your ways. He's telling them, think about what you're doing. Think about what you've been doing. Because remember, we studied that there was a letter received from some of the people around them. They didn't, you can look through this in the study of the book of Ezra. We're not going to go back and read all of it today. But they had some people that wanted to come worship with them. And they say, we worship the Lord God as you do. And Zerubbabel says, oh, no, you don't. Get packing. And so they write a letter of indignation to their legal counsel, and their legal counsel, upcharges them a few $100s per hour on that letter, as making it look nice and pretty and sending it on to the king. And so the king looks at this nice, pretty letter from this really expensive legal counsel and says, "No more building. You're done." And so from that point on, they stop building. And then there's a new king that comes in, and it's 2 years into the reign of Darius, and they still haven't done anything once this new king has come in. And Haggai gets up and says, I think it's about time we start. God pushes him, and God inspires him, and God says through Haggai, you all need to consider your ways. Pay attention. What are you doing? Why did you come back here for in the first place? Was it just to let the temple sit and rot? Was it to let the city sit and rot and just, live like you did back over there? The whole point is for you to be able to rebuild the temple and establish your sacrifices again and follow my law, is what he's saying to them. And they're just sitting there, sitting on it. Procrastination is a bad habit, one that I fall into quite often. But that's some 20 years is some serious procrastination. 14 years to be fair. So it says in verse 14, And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came and did work in the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, in the 24th day of the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. And so this is the 2nd year that Haggai is saying these things. And so it says in chapter 2, verse 1, in the 7th month, in the 21st day of the month, and this is the same year, came the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory, and how do ye see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? And so he says, right now it's still not built. It took them another 4 years after this. If you look back in the book of Ezra, they started building again in the 2nd year of Darius the king. They didn't finish it until the 6th. So it took them 4 years. And he says, Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, and be strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work, for I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. And if God is with you, you can't have anybody else better. He says, You do the work, and I'll support you. You do the work, and I'm there. I'm there helping you. And so this is an encouragement to the people. It's meant to help them to get the work done. It's meant to help them to follow God's will in their lives, because he says, You do my will, and I'm there. And you can take that message and apply it to us today. If we're witnessing and we're following the will of God, even if there's persecution towards us, even if there's hatred and backlash and chances of actual loss of your job even, a lot of Christians, and I myself have had this thought run through my head in the past, just kind of thinking about it. And I think, Paul says that somebody who doesn't provide for his family is no worse than an infidel. So should people really go as far to put their job at risk? Well, if it's the Lord's will and you put your job at risk and you lose it, I'm sure he can line something else up for you to provide for your family. And it's not as if you're trying to do God's will and you're a member of your church, that you can't go to your church and say, Hey, look what happened. I don't think there's a person in here who'd let somebody starve after they lost their job because they were trying to witness for Christ. You might not be able to go and buy a big fancy new vehicle, or you might not be able to go and get a side-by-side or buy a new house on the money that you'd get, but I think that everybody in here understands that we'd feed one another, at the very least. So there's that. So we ought to be following God's will for our lives at all times, regardless of whatever the cost may be to us in the short term. Because remember, even though we may lose out on things here, we're building up treasures up there. Paul says in Colossians to set our affections on things above. That should be all that needs to be said about it, but people still worry about the things down here more than we should, I think. So we see that the people have been encouraged, and so it says starting in verse 20 of Haggai chapter 2, it says, And again the word of the Lord came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and I will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. And you see here that God has chosen these people and called them to a very special purpose, to be the rebuilders. Now, this isn't restoration, this is rebuilding. That's not the same thing. Restoration doesn't occur until Christ does the rebuilding. He's got to be here physically for the restoration to happen. You don't see restoration without the Messiah. You don't see restoration without Christ. He's there. He's necessary for it. But here is a rebuilding. And God is in the rebuilding just as much as he's in the restoration. Don't get me wrong. It's not that God doesn't see this as important, because he sees it as important. It's a stage, it's a phase that leads up to his plan for the second coming of Christ. Not only the second coming, but it was also part of the first coming. There was a temple in Jerusalem when Christ went there. In order for there to be a temple there, somebody had to build it. This is the rebuilding. And you could say, well, Herod did a whole lot to it, and, well, yeah, sure. He spent a lot of money and had a whole lot of things added to it, had a whole lot of jewelry and gold and silver overlays put on it, but he didn't build the foundations of it. He didn't set it up. God called these people to do that, and that's what they did. So that's our review for this morning. Like I said, Zechariah chapters 1 through 6 is where you see the visions. Chapters 7 and 8 are kind of those historical events and prophecies that took place. And then chapters 9 forward are going to be the burdens of the word of the Lord. And there's 2 of them there in chapters 9 through 14. So we'll probably do our quiz over probably 1 over Habakkuk and Zephaniah, probably 1 over Haggai and the first 6 chapters of Zechariah. Then we'll probably have 1 here a few weeks from now over chapters 7 and 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12 of the book of Zechariah, and then 1 over chapters 13 and 14 after we finish the book. Zechariah's got a lot of information and details in it. As a proportion, as a percentage, it has more that makes it up about Christ and about the Messiah, about Him specifically, I think, than any other book in the Old Testament. Just proportionally. Now, of course, Isaiah has more overall information about Jesus because it's a much, much, much larger book. But when you condense it and you get down into it, Zechariah has more proportionally. He spends more of his time talking about it. So, there's a lot to go through. There's a lot of information there, and I want to take my time on it. I think it would do us well to really dig into some of those things a little bit more. We may take more than 1 week on some chapters once we get toward the end, but we'll just follow the Lord's will and try to spend as much time on it as He wants us to spend. And once we get through it, we'll keep going on, but we'll follow His will, and that's the best way to do it. As far as I'm concerned. So.